Lord of the Mysteries audiobook by Kevin 571. Huge Pressure Audrey simply mentioned the ancient folk song, but she didn't describe the content in detail. She was afraid that the knowledgeable ma'am hermit would be able to guess at the exact location. She only mentioned the inspiration she had, and how she used a psychological cue to retain her lucidity in her dream before beginning a magical journey. Psychological cue. She knows how to plant a psychological cue. She's likely a Sequence 7 psychiatrist. Katlia habitually made a judgment, but she immediately felt even more perplexed. Then why would she be buying the Beyonder characteristic of a psychiatrist? Taking the same potion gives a limited increase in strength while being prone to losing control. Furthermore, it will be an obstacle towards the digestion of the potion. To create a mystical item, but this will overlap with her own Beyonder powers. There's no value to that. To give it to someone else. Amidst Katlia's guesses, Audrey had already mentioned her chaotic dream and how she came to the edge of her conscious. Then, she used the conjuring method she learned from Mr. Fool to create a staircase that led downwards. She then slowly delved deep into her conscious. She didn't describe in detail the various points of light in her subconscious, as it involved embarrassing secrets she didn't wish to share. She focused on her lonely and long journey with no end in sight. She also expressed how there were various monsters hiding in the surrounding grayness that placed immense pressure on her. She mentioned how she nearly broke down several times and barely managed to endure it thanks to her Beyonder powers. Then, she reached the point of her finally arriving at the illusory sea of collective subconscious. The memory imprints of the human pioneers and the spread and reflection of the consciousness of the surrounding creatures were presented under Audrey's coherent and unhurried descriptions. Then it was fixed onto the dragon with grayish stone scales that had flown out from the sea of collective subconscious. There's a dragon that lives in the sea of collective subconscious. What a magical and beautiful journey. Although Miss Justice didn't encounter any enemies or danger, it still leaves me a little surreal. For suddenly thought of a title of a book, Miss Justice's Dream Tour. While rounding things up, Audrey scanned the area and asked, "Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any suggestions? Do you think that the Dragon City of Miracles live side is also hidden in the sea of collective subconscious? If I wish to continue searching, what should I take note of? What advanced preparations do I need to make?" The hanged man Alger glanced at the hermit and said in a serious tone, "I don't think you should continue exploring. It's a very dangerous act. According to the records, most dragons are creatures with flesh and blood. This includes the mind dragon. By allowing itself to survive and swim through the so-called sea of collective subconscious, it means that the dragon you saw was a sufficiently high sequence. At the very least, it's at the level of a demigod. Before you reach sequence 5, it's best that you don't consider this." Katlia nodded and said, "There are many other dangerous things in the sea of collective subconscious, the accumulated maleficent thoughts of humanity, the desires that can corrupt soul bodies, the terrifying memories since ancient times that resemble storms and waves at sea. All of these will deal severe psychological harm to you. It might prevent you from ever waking up. Besides, that's the sea of collective subconscious of all creatures, which isn't only limited to humans. There might be evil spirits, evil gods, or the consciousness of some terrifying existence hidden in there. They're like gigantic maelstroms that can devour ships. Before you truly acquire Beyonder powers that allow you to travel through the sea of collective subconscious, it's best not to rashly explore too deeply." Audrey, who was filled with expectations, felt disappointed. However, she couldn't help but admit that Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit had spoken very logically and sincerely. She silently inhaled and said to herself, "Audrey, don't be headstrong. Wait till you're sequence 5 before making the attempt again." She totally didn't consider how difficult it was to become a sequence 5. At that level, One could even compete to become one of the 7 pirate admirals, or even make the 7 become 8. From Audrey's point of view, with Mr. Fool and the Tarot Club, as long as she was careful and calm, she would definitely be able to successfully attain that level in a year or 2 if she didn't take unnecessary risks. Only the gate to being a demigod was hard to push open. Ma'am Hermit knows a lot and is very knowledgeable. Audrey clung onto the last sliver of hope and looked towards Mr. Fool at the end of the table, hoping that this godlike existence would provide a suggestion that was different from Mr. Hanged Man or Ma'am Hermit. Don't look at me. I have no idea. Klein tried his best not to blink. His understanding of the conscious, subconscious, and the collective subconscious was still stuck at a theoretical level that spirit medium Dolly had described. He didn't understand anything more. Despite having his dreams intruded frequently, he had never thought of exploring the world outside the dream despite retaining his lucidity. Therefore, how was he to provide any suggestions to Miss Justice? In fact, he had a natural idea regarding this. However, he wasn't sure if it would work without having done any verification. In the past, even if he lacked the confidence, he could vaguely make a comment, but now, with Admiral of Stars Catlia sitting at the side watching, it only made it easier for him to make mistakes the more he spoke. The less he spoke, the fewer mistakes he would commit, and there was no chance of making mistakes by keeping silent. What a pressure-inducing new member! Klein sighed inwardly. He didn't say a word and maintained his faint smile. If not for him being above the gray fog and how he existed in the form of a spirit body, he suspected that such highly difficult acting would make the muscles around his eyes spasm. Mr. Fool doesn't have any suggestions. Audrey retracted her gaze in depression. She stopped fantasizing about exploring the sea of collective subconscious so soon. At this moment, the Moon Emlyn, who was already turning impatient, cleared his throat. I've seriously researched the history handed down by us Sanguine. Sanguine, he really is a vampire. Nurturing vampires and pulling vampires into the church is really a tradition of the Church of Mother Earth. Catlia nodded as she looked like she was listening seriously. Meanwhile, she felt that some of her conclusions needed adjustments. The moon directly expressed his identity. Does this mean that Mr. Fool has a potent deterrence, even in the outside world, that the members aren't afraid of information being leaked? It seems like I don't have to completely hide my circumstances. Emlyn paused and looked at the sun before tipping his chin. Before the cataclysm, there was no city of silver, only the kingdom of silver. If it were anyone else who had thrown such doubt on him, Derek would have hastened to retort, expressing the fact that the people of the city of silver were descendants of the kingdom of silver, and that he hadn't lied. However, after glancing at Mr. Moon and sensing his smugness, Derek turned his head to the side, feeling that an explanation was beneath him. Why must I let an arrogant vampire who doesn't acknowledge the City of Silver's history believe me? He thought silently to himself. From his reaction, Emlyn could tell that the City of Silver was indeed related to the Kingdom of Silver. He tusked and said, "The faith of the Kingdom of Silver wasn't originally Giant King Almir, but his queen, Umbella." Umbella, Derek turned his head and blurted out, "Our City of Silver has no records of this matter, nor are there any records of a queen named Umbella." Emlyn chuckled and spread out his hands. "That's why there's nothing wrong with me saying that your City of Silver's history is flawed and incomplete, right? Clearly, there are mistakes in your records of sanguine history. You took such a roundabout way to prove this. Should I say that a vampire like you has clear logic, or that you're someone who bears grudges?" Klein held back his laughter and stopped himself from sizing up Emlyn White. The moon and the sun's debate benefited him greatly, allowing him to know that the giant queen, the goddess of harvest, was named Umbella. The sun Derek was just about to give a retort to Mr. Moon when he heard Ma'am Hermit speak. Umbella is the goddess of harvest from the second epoch. She's also the queen of the giant king's court. Legend has it that she perished at the end of the second epoch, but it's impossible to verify since no one has seen her corpse or relics. The goddess of harvest is really named Umbella. Derek was stunned. He wished to retort, but he was unable to say a word as this matter proved that the history of the City of Silver had several holes. He instantly felt somewhat aggrieved. When Lin saw this, he felt good. Pleasure rose from the depths of his heart. After another round of exchanges, the tarot gathering came to an end. Klein smiled and said, "Everyone, we shall meet next week." "By your will." Audrey immediately got up to bow. The others weren't any slower, including the hermit Catlia. Upon returning to reality, Admiral of Stars Catlia looked at the shattered celestial globe on her desk. She then seriously recalled what had happened at the gathering. A few details made her believe that the Tarot Club involved itself in many matters that made it nothing to scoff at, and hidden deep in the gray fog was Mr. Fool. Like the world, who was hidden behind thick shadows, he was unreadable and unfathomable. It was unknown what he was planning. After more than 10 seconds of silence, Catlia retrieved a pen and some paper and wrote while deliberating. "Someone has been deliberately collecting the Emperor's diary pages." She didn't dare to expose any information that involved the Tarot Club, as she was afraid of being punished by Mr. Fool. All she could do was give a heads-up on things that could be discovered under ordinary circumstances. After she was done writing and folding the letter, she took out a golden, exquisite harmonica she carried with her. Putting it to her lips, she blew it. In the blink of an eye, she saw the letter strangely vanish. Even though she wasn't wearing her glasses, she was unable to discover the arrival of the messenger few. Catlia sighed and reached for her forehead and said silently, "The pressure is really huge when participating in a gathering while under the supervision of a god. With Admiral of Stars joining, the pressure on me as the Fool has greatly increased." Klein rubbed his temples above the gray fog and directly returned to the real world. He wanted to attempt the inspiration Miss Justice had received from exploring her dreams. 572 Recite my name after a series of chores. Klein opened his locked bedroom door and looked into the living room. He saw Danitz sleeping soundly on a reclining chair. Although he had long heard it, Klein couldn't help but lampoon. "It's not even 4 in the afternoon. Has this guy completely let his hair down now that he doesn't need to monitor the radio transceiver?" With a thought, he gradually smiled, feeling that this was exactly what he needed. The premise of him maintaining his lucidity in dreams had involved someone invading his consciousness. Typically, his dreams were a turbid mess, which meant that he alone wasn't able to complete the experiment after all. He couldn't plant a psychological cue on himself. Therefore, he planned on using external forces to enter the dreams of others. This way, he could maintain his lucidity like a nightmare. He originally planned on heading out to find a suitable target, but Danitz's posture was in such a perfect state that he could hardly stop himself from kicking him. "No, I should be experimenting." Klein corrected his thoughts. He contemplated for a moment and didn't use a dream charm. As a sequence 7 pyromaniac, with the ancient name being Fire Mage, Danitz's spiritual perception wasn't to be written off. Once he softly chanted an incantation that could stir the powers of nature, Danitz would definitely be awoken. As such, it would be a question of whether he could evade the matter in a timely fashion. After some deliberation, Klein took out another thing he had prepared. It was a gem-like object that seemed dark and deep. It was the Beyonder characteristic left behind by a nightmare. It could be used to a certain extent, just like Nimble Right Master Risego's all-black eye. However, the effects were inferior to one that was from a mystical item. For example, this nightmare Beyonder characteristic didn't allow Klein to pass through the dreams of someone across the city from his inn suite, nor was he able to forcefully pull people into a dream. However, it was still simple enough to perform the most basic form of intruding into someone's dream at a close distance. Klein held the dark gem and spread out his spirituality. The illusory darkness rapidly spread before his eyes, filling his vision. Everything before his eyes were blanketed over, including Danitz. There was no longer a humanoid figure, but an ellipsoidal blob of light. Klein immediately extended his spirituality out and made contact with it without any warning. Various scenes flooded his surroundings as they flashed rapidly. Finally, it came to stop on a ship that was dozens of meters long. It had a smoke-churning chimney and large sails that were fully raised. The deck was polished abnormally bright, shimmering with the glimmer of a gold coin. When sunlight hit it, Danitz stood under the main cannon as he had his arms crossed. He was leisurely rushing the sailors, shouting from time to time, "Scrub that area again. Dogsh T, do you wish to copy down the ancient Fasak dictionary? This fellow is quite impressive on the Golden Dream." Klein ignored the owner of the dream and flew to the other end of the ship. He found a hidden spot and landed on the deck before preparing to test his spiritual perception. What he planned on experimenting on was simple. He wanted to know if chanting the fool's honorific name in a dream was effective. He wanted to know if he could sense someone praying. This way, if Miss Justice encounters danger in the sea of collective subconscious, she can use this method to seek help. After stretching his back, Klein's expression gradually turned solemn as he softly said, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. Chinese letter He, king of yellow and black who wields good luck." With the words in Hermes being spoken, he very quickly finished reciting the fool's honorific name. However, Klein didn't hear the series of illusory pleas. "It doesn't work." Klein frowned in thought. He analyzed whether it was really impossible or if he had made a mistake somewhere. Yes, chanting in the dream doesn't actually produce any noise. Relying on Hermes alone isn't sufficient. To achieve the effects of praying, I'll have to use a language like ancient Hermes that can stir the powers of nature. This is the same state as me copying the account password of my anonymous account. Klein nodded slightly and began to chant his honorific name in ancient Hermes. He wasn't afraid that there would be an accident, but that his stirring of the powers of nature would wake blazing Danitz from his sleep. He recited each word, quickly finishing the 3 sentences. Following that, Klein heard the stacked series of irritable and illusory pleas. At that moment, Danitz's dream quivered as the golden dream quickly disintegrated. Klein didn't stay any longer and immediately left. He returned back to his bedroom before Danitz woke up. After 7 to 8 seconds, Danitz sat up in a daze as he muttered to himself in fear. "Why did I dream of that madman Jam and Sparrow causing trouble on the Golden Dream? What a terrifying matter, Dogsh T. It must be the result of me worrying over this matter all this time." Inside the bedroom, Klein had already taken 4 steps counterclockwise and gone above the gray fog. Without any surprises, he saw a rippling light by the fool's high-backed chair. In it was the scene of him in the dream. It really works. One can still receive a response when chanting the fool's honorific name in languages such as ancient Hermes or Jotun. It's no wonder some people might suddenly die in their sleep despite not doing a thing. They might be reading some materials or had memorized certain symbols in the day and accidentally replicated them in the dream. The danger in this world really cannot be prevented. Klein dispelled the rippling light and considered if he should inform Miss Justice of the results of the experiment. To only inform her later instead of saying it on the spot is a little damaging to the fool's image. But Miss Justice is the kind of girl with a huge sense of curiosity. Although she has been warned by Mr. Hanged Man and Admiral of Stars, and even if she's a little more mature now, there's still the chance of her taking risks. Of course, if anything were to happen, it's on herself and it has nothing to do with me. Klein couldn't help but recall Miss Justice's adoration of the fool and the thought of her optimism and cheerfulness that brought him happiness, as well as her contributions towards the Tarot Club all this time. Finally, he sighed and said in a self-deprecating manner, "I still need to inform her and give a warning. This is the treatment a VIP gets." After making the decision, Klein didn't hesitate to spread out his spirituality to touch the crimson star representing Miss Justice. In a room of the huge manor in East Chester County, Audrey had her legs leaning sideways as she sat before her dressing table. She was recalling the words Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit had said. After being warned by two senior Beyonders, she suddenly realized something. It wasn't that the mid and upper echelons of the psychology alchemists wasn't aware that one could explore dreams, the icy mountain of the subconscious, and the sea of collective subconscious by using a self-induced psychological cue. The reason why they didn't tell me anything is because it's too dangerous for a psychiatrist. Many people have already died in such explorations. But they should warn me. Ah, right. From their point of view, I'm only a Sequence 8 telepathist. I'm not equipped with the powers of a psychological cue, so there was no need to warn me. Audrey finally understood the perplexing matter. Just as she was about to let Susie enter the room to calm the disappointment in her heart, she suddenly saw thick gray fog spew out, instantly flooding her vision. In the middle of the endless grayish-white, a figure sat in a high-backed chair. Looking down at her, it said, "Do not make attempts without careful consideration." Before Audrey realized what was happening, she heard the deep and majestic voice sound out again. "If you encounter dangers in your dreams, you can recite my name." Recite your name. Audrey's eyes widened as she became overjoyed. "Yes, Mr. Fool." Seeing that Miss Justice was excited instead of showing any doubts, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief and chuckled. "Use ancient Hermes." With that said, his figure faded away and the gray fog vanished. Audrey sat there stunned for 2 seconds before hurriedly pursing her lips, afraid that she wasn't on her best behavior. Mr. Fool actually specially warned me. He even permitted me to recite his name in my dream. Audrey excitedly took a few steps on the spot, believing that she had really become an adorer of God. Of course, she also remembered Mr. Fool's warning. She planned to understand more from the psychology alchemists and make another attempt only when she was sufficiently prepared. The corners of her mouth curled up slightly as she randomly tapped her chest, saying silently, "May Mr. Fool watch over me." Above the gray fog, Klein began to consider another matter. Red-haired Helene, who had a reward worth £1,000, was actually related to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. Tracy took over Kalangos's crew and changed his flagship to the Black Death. As for Kalangos, he previously plundered a tycoon named Jimmy Necker. That tycoon had previously obtained parts of Death's chronicles. It came from a Balem royal family's mausoleum. This information came from that nightmare inside Creeping Hunger. It should benefit Mr. Azicto a certain extent. I can also investigate the matter in passing. Klein found another reason to look forward to finding red-haired Helene. He originally planned on using the magic mirror, Arrows, to find her, but now he planned on mobilizing Sea God believers to perform a search. In the past, it's quite demeaning to send a revelation for just £1,000, but now that it involves a pirate admiral, it can barely make people guess that there are secret motives behind it. Klein conjured red-haired Helene's photo and summoned the Sea God scepter. He had never done a mass revelation, so it was possible that it would be a burden that he couldn't withstand. He chose higher-ups like Calat and Edmonton. With waves reaching high into the sky as a background, he said in a deep voice, "Find her and protect her. Be careful of Tracy's forces." Klein didn't provide further explanations as he broke down this scene along with red-haired Helene's photo into many sets before projecting them into the corresponding dots of Light 573, teaching a lesson in reality in a forest in Blue Mountain Island, where the Resistance base was located. Sitting in a wheelchair, Callet raised his bald head and looked towards the sunlight that was scattering at the cave's entrance. His eyes couldn't hide his joy. He acutely sensed that ever since God reappeared over the land and stated his 10 Commandments, the previous bloodshed and chaos had changed. From time to time, he would provide them with guidance which was filled with wisdom. Furthermore, he would observe all creatures and proactively interfere with the situation at sea in a bid to help the Resistance and everyone in Rorsted, allowing them to pass through a difficult, thorny path while still being able to see some hope. Perhaps this is the true meaning behind his reappearance over the land. Callet recalled the revelation he had just received and guessed that the red-haired woman named Helene was like a fulcrum for Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and the forces out at sea. She was the key to spoiling the balance between the countries, and only by making the world's situation more chaotic would the people of Rorsted receive the opportunity of being liberated. Callet drew in a breath and quickly set up a ritual to pray to see God, conjuring Helene's picture. After doing all of this, he instinctively turned his head to the side and wore a somewhat mixed expression. Living in that direction was the high priest of the Church of Sea God, a priest who was a high-ranking member of the Resistance. Although they don't dare go against the revelations and have made tremendous changes in many ways, they're still immersed in the past. They're obstinate, conservative, backward, and savage. They refuse to embrace a more civilized church. If this goes on, they'll one day be abandoned by God. Callet couldn't hide the smile in his heart while he felt a strong sense of anguish. After scanning through all the believers' prayers and picking a few to respond to, Klein returned to the real world. He planned on heading out to search for a chance to enact true acting. When his right hand gripped the door handle, a ridiculous but possible thought came to his mind. My true goal is not to find red-haired Helene, but to use this opportunity to get to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and figure out what happened to Tycoon Jimmy Necker, so as to get to know the location of the ancient chronicles of death. That is to say, I only need to lure Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy out with red-haired Helene. As for whether she's the real person or not, that doesn't matter. I can make myself red-haired Helene and let Danitz send me to Strongman Ozil, get the reward, and easily meet Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. What an impressive sequence of actions. Klein suddenly shook his head as he found a reason to reject the idea. Although I'm a faceless, I can't accept wearing drag. Could it be that overcoming my inner resistance is also one of the principles for acting? Furthermore, I don't know red-haired Helene. Acting as her wouldn't work. I would just be like her on the surface, and I wouldn't be able to fool people who are familiar with her. That way, I won't be able to meet Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. Yes, the person searching for red-haired Helene might not be Tracy, but an enemy of hers. I don't know Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy's background. Rashly doing such an act would result in immeasurable danger. It's best to be safe and abide by my wishes. I'll first search for red-haired Helene, and after determining the details, I can consider the subsequent actions. At that moment, Klein suddenly felt that something was amiss in the living room. Danitz's snoring had softened, and the time between each snore shortened. Vice Admiral Iceberg is here. Klein turned the handle and opened the door to the bedroom. While making this silent action, Danitz sat up with his eyes open. He tried hard to hide his smile as he said, "Captain came. She said that Admiral of Blood's crew was sighted at Longtail Island and is continuing south. His destination seems to be the Berserk Sea. The source of the news is trustworthy, Longtail Island, the island at the southern end of the Rorsted Sea. From the looks of it, Admiral of Blood previously planned on coming to Bayam, but the fight between Calvatua and King John Cotman scared him away. He circled around the area and headed straight for the Berserk Sea. Yes, it's probably because his intelligence officer, Old Quinn, didn't send a telegram to inform him. Klein felt pangs of regret and could only lament how reality changed faster than his plans. He had planned to make his hunt of Admiral of Blood become the crowning battle of the crazy adventurer and bounty hunter, J.M. and Sparrow. Killing a single steel Maveti ultimately lacks that shock and awe effect. Klein didn't say a word as he calmly looked at Danitz. Danitz felt a little uneasy from the intense stare as he gave a hollow chuckle. Admiral of Blood has fled. Your cooperation with Captain has come to an end, right? I can now return to the Golden Dream, right? Further developments can be done via your messenger. Klein pondered for a moment and took out a piece of paper from his pocket. He scribbled the method to summon his messenger. Following that, he flicked his wrist, sending the piece of paper out like a metallic plate. Danitz was a hunter at Sequence 9, so he easily reached out and caught the piece of paper. He scanned it before a scarlet flame rose in his palms, burning the paper to ashes. Haha, even if I forget it, Captain will have a way of making me recall it. He paused and squeezed out a smile before asking again. I can now return to the Golden Dream, right? Klein nodded slightly and said, Yes, I can. Danitz held back his urge to pump his fist in celebration, afraid that he would end up antagonizing the madman J.M. and Sparrow. He smiled cautiously and said, I first pay off the room for this period of time and buy a ship ticket. As you know, Bayem hasn't been calm recently. Captain doesn't wish for the Golden Dream to dock at the harbor here. At least you know how to settle the room's payment. Klein didn't say a word as he maintained his austere attitude. He draped himself with a coat and took his hat before walking towards his luxurious suite. When his back disappeared into the corner of a staircase and vanished from Danitz's sight, Danitz shrank back into his room and clenched his fist, pumping them into the air. Wonderful, wonderful. I'm finally free. He didn't delay in wearing his cap and heading to the front desk of the Wind of Azure Inn to settle the bill. He informed them that this didn't mean that he was checking out. Danitz quickly hit the streets and ran straight for a place known as the Seaweed Bar. He found the air fresh and invigorating. After he took a few steps, he suddenly noticed bounty posters pasted along the walls around a bend. Blazing Danitz, 5,500 pounds. The posters were just 2 steps away from Danitz. That familiar face allowed for a clear comparison with his cap-wearing face. Danitz clenched his teeth and revealed a sorrowful smile. He hurriedly pressed down his cap, nearly concealing his normal line of sight, but even so, he still felt uneasy. He went to a recent department store and bought a gray scarf. He wrapped it around his neck and hid his nose and mouth in it. At this point in time, Danitz relaxed somewhat as he sped up his pace and rushed for his destination. The Seaweed Bar was a place where gangs gathered. It was common for infamous pirates to appear there. Although this place wasn't like the Swordfish Bar or Amorous Leaf Bar that allowed access to a lot of information and resources, it had its own unique niche. It had many resourceful secret channels. What Danitz wanted to do was buy a scalp ticket to Gallegos, as this wouldn't need him to provide any identification. He knew very well that, be it in the past or present, his bounty poster would be plastered across all the ticket booths. He had bought the first-class tickets to the White Agate via the same method as well. After entering the bar, Danitz didn't take off his cap and scarf. He carefully surveyed the area and found Daniel, who sold scalp tickets. He didn't directly approach him, and instead retracted his gaze from the thin and somewhat swarthy man who was in his 30s. He began searching for someone unfamiliar. After a round of choices, Danitz squeezed through the crowd and arrived beside a lad who was drinking at the bar counter. He tapped him on the shoulder and suppressed his voice. "Do me a favor." "What?" The lad turned his head warily and ended up seeing a suspicious man. The lower half of his face was covered in a gray scarf, and the cap on his head nearly hid his eyes. He revealed almost nothing about his face. Such a dress-up simply meant that he was suspicious. This was because the Rorsted archipelago's lowest temperature during the winter was about 10 degrees C. Danitz pointed at Daniel. "See that guy over there? Buy me a ticket for Gallegos tomorrow. The rest is yours." Although a scalped ticket was much more expensive than a retail ticket, Gallegos wasn't too far, making £3 more than sufficient, of course. This was also because the journey was relatively shorter, and there was no need for him to buy a first-class ticket. The reason why Danitz didn't buy it himself was because he was worried that Daniel would recognize him, bringing him unwanted trouble. Back when his bounty was only £3,000, pirates and adventurers at his level or lower had to consider how many people were needed to take him down. The bounty received wasn't something that could make them forget about their fear towards Vice Admiral Iceberg and the risk of losing their lives. Hence, very few people would take the initiative to attack him. As such, his safety was pretty much guaranteed in such black markets. But now, his bounty reward had already reached £5,500. Even if several people joined forces, the amount of money each of them could get was a sizable sum. Furthermore, there were many people out at sea who were desperados. Apart from that, there would be people who found their own bounties too low and wished to prove their strength. These people would definitely challenge a target like Danitz, who was infamous but was of little risk. It was precisely because of this that Danitz was afraid that Daniel would betray him. Therefore, he hired a random person to buy it on his behalf. The lad held the cash and gave Danitz another look before getting up from his seat. He then walked towards Daniel. He deliberately slowed down his footsteps when he walked past some drunkards as he whispered to them. When Danitz saw this scene, he suddenly became guarded. He thought of a problem with him acting suspiciously. It was very obvious that there was a problem with him. He was a perfect target for being betrayed. Do you think my reputation as blazing was bought? Danitz planned on teaching the lad a lesson after he obtained the ticket. At this point, he discovered that a familiar figure had walked in. He was an infamous pirate, Blue Eyes Meath, with a bounty of £2,800. And this pirate clearly knew this group of people were planning to betray him. Blue Eyes Meath still has a few rather powerful subordinates. Danitz didn't hesitate to get up and head for the bar's back door. His speed increased as he agilely forced himself through the drunkards and escaped from the bar. Then, with his rich anti-tracking skills, he completely escaped from the group of people. Danitz didn't dare to stay on the street since it was already dark. The patrolling police and soldiers would begin increasing. He went straight back to the Wind of Azure Inn and opened the door to the luxurious suite. Inside, he saw J.M. and Sparrow admiring the dusk. Danitz had a thought as he forced a smile. "There's something. I forgot to mention it just now. Captain wishes to ask if you have any interest in meeting her at Gallegos." This was a question he had previously kept secret. He had planned on returning and telling his captain that J.M. and Sparrow wasn't interested. But now he realized that he had a low chance of surviving in Bayam once he was separated from the crazy adventurer. 574 failed to accomplish head to Gallegos to meet Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards. Klein was taken aback, nearly frowning in the process. This wasn't something he considered unacceptable, but instead a chance for him to use this face-to-face meeting to ask about matters with trite details that were cumbersome to pin down. It was possible for him to be inspired and gain information for his subsequent advancement and high-sequence potion formulas. One more friend, one more channel. Klein silently muttered this sentence before taking out a heavy gold coin. He divined if there was any danger in front of blazing Danitz. The shiny gold coin flipped into the air and tumbled down into Klein's palm, tails facing up. This implied a negative response, which meant that there wasn't much danger meeting Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina in Gallegos. Klein shifted his gaze upwards at Danitz and calmly said, "Okay. On the captain's behalf, I thank you for accepting the invitation." Danitz heaved a sigh of relief and beamed, his brows easing. Klein took a look at the wall clock and said, "I first head to the washroom." "Head to the washroom? You mean you plan on heading out later to buy a ticket for me?" Danitz's gaze followed J.M. Sparrow's body as he sharply read in between the lines. After using spirit dowsing to confirm things above the gray fog, Klein washed his hands and left the washroom and said to Danitz, "Let's go." "Me?" Danitz pointed at himself. Klein put on his coat and nodded. "There's no need to, right? You can directly find Elland and get him to help us buy 2 tickets." In this rare occasion, Danitz sincerely provided a suggestion. Klein coldly swept his glance across him and didn't say a word. He wore his hat and went out the door. Danitz trembled and swallowed his second suggestion of buying fake identification documents and used J.M. Sparrow's ability to change appearances to buy 2 tickets via official channels. He wrapped the scarf around him once again and pressed down on his cap before quickly following J.M. Sparrow. After nearly 20 minutes, Klein pointed ahead where there was a noisy commotion. "Is it there?" That was the seaweed bar where Danitz had failed to accomplish the purchase of scalped tickets. Yes. Danitz never expected them to circle over and was momentarily stunned. Along the way, he had roughly described his early experience. Therefore, he wasn't sure why J.M. Sparrow would return here. Amid his thought, he suddenly had a guess as he blurted, Are you going to seek revenge for me? This fellow might be crazy, but he's quite nice to his friends." His act of venturing out into Banzi Harbor for Elland and the others is an example. Danitz couldn't help but reflect on the matter. Klein shot him a glance and didn't say a word. He widened his strides and walked into the seaweed bar. "There's really no need." Danitz followed behind as he weakly persuaded him. To him, if he wasn't afraid of escalating the matter, he would have baked those bunch of backstabbing bustards in cement and sank them to the bottom of the sea. The bar was noisy and lively, with local music reverberating through it, bringing about a trance-like feeling. Danitz seriously surveyed the area in an attempt to find the bunch of backstabbers, as well as the infamous pirate Blue Eyes Meath. "That's Daniel," Danitz casually introduced the black market merchant. "What a pity that this place is just too chaotic. I've no idea if that group of people are still around." He thought with some regret. Klein traced his gaze and touched creeping hunger with his right hand. He turned his head and looked at Danitz, saying with his usual expression, "Take off your scarf." His tone was akin to instructing Danitz to buy a glass of beer. Danitz was left stunned on the spot as he wondered if he had heard wrong. Klein widened the ends of his mouth and said, "Take off your scarf. Do not make me repeat thrice." "Why?" Danitz choked back his question under the icy cold and crazy stare. He blankly removed his scarf in puzzlement, and he had a baffling feeling that the people around him were sizing him up and also recognizing him as the great pirate worth 5,500 pounds, Blazing Danitz. Klein maintained his smile that concealed madness and continued instructing, "Take off your cap. Go over and buy a ticket." In an instant, Danitz felt as though he had been struck by lightning. He nearly leaped up. "I be recognized." Under J.M. Sparrow's stare, his voice became softer and softer. At this point in time, he had already understood what J.M. Sparrow was up to. "He wishes to use my worth as 5,500 pounds as bait to fish out those greedy pirates and powerhouses behind those gangs. Dogsh T. To think I thought he was nice to his friends a moment ago. No, why would I even consider him my friend? This son of a beach." Danitz kept cursing inwardly with vulgarities. He couldn't put up any resistance since he knew how crazy J.M. Sparrow was. This was a madman who was even thinking of hunting a pirate admiral. Danitz revealed a twisted smile. As he slowly turned his head back, He took off his cap and slowly walked towards Daniel. Around him, gazes swept past him and paused for 2 seconds before they were retracted. As the drunkards moved away from him like the receding tide, they opened a wide path for him as though the ocean was split. Upon seeing their reaction, Danitz was surprised at this turn of events despite his horror and concerns. This is the might of a great pirate. This is what it feels like to be the center of attention. Damn it, I heard someone say my name. Someone is whispering blazing. Danitz knew he had been recognized. As he walked forward anxiously, he hung his hands down and prepared to do battle. Among the crowd, Blue Eyes Meath blurted out, "Danitz, blazing Danitz." His subordinates exchanged looks and said excitedly, "Boss, it's really blazing Danitz. 5,500 pounds. Shall we attack?" Meath narrowed his azure-blue eyes and raised his left arm, slapping the back of his subordinate's head. "You stupida, if blazing Danitz were a stupida like you, he would have been killed numerous times. He dared to appear here because he's not afraid of being attacked. He has a powerhouse hiding behind him." Meath suddenly felt horrified as he looked around. He suspected that Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards had secretly arrived in the city of Generosity, Bayam. Through the gaps in between the crowd, he saw a young gentleman in a black double-breasted frock coat. He wore a half-top hat and had black hair and brown eyes. He looked thin, but he had an angled face. Without any words, Meath's spiritual perception told him that this was a terrifying existence. His high spiritual perception had previously brought him numerous troubles, but it had also helped him successfully evade even more dangers. "Let's go." He suppressed his voice as he ordered. Then, with the help of the patrons blocking him, he fled from the bar's back door just like how Danitz did previously. Danitz came right in front of Daniel while shuddering in fear before buying 2 tickets to Gallegos from a blank and horrified opponent. Even after he returned the way he came and received the signal from J.M. and Sparrow to walk out the bar, he didn't notice anyone suddenly assaulting him. Isn't it said that there are many desperados among pirates? Indeed, a last-minute and rushed trap is hardly effective. Something abnormal usually implies that something is amiss. Of course, one can use the abnormality to scare the enemy. Unfortunately, Klein pressed down on his hat before following Danitz out. At that moment in time, Danitz was loitering around a street lamp. When he saw J.M. and Sparrow walk out, he barely smiled and said, "Can I wear the scarf and cap already? Ha-ha, that group of cowards." "Yes." Klein didn't stop as he sped up once he reached the other end of the street. Danitz's pupils contracted as he hurriedly chased after him and inquired, "Why are we suddenly running?" Klein didn't turn his head as he calmly said, "Do you wish to stay here to be invited back by the mandated punishers?" As he spoke, he took out a paper figurine, threw it out, and burned it to ashes. Only then did Danitz snap to his senses. Although that group of cowards didn't dare to attack him, they definitely had the courage to report him. If he was successfully taken down, they still had a chance of receiving parts of the reward. They ran all the way into a secluded alley before J.M. and Sparrow stopped. Only then did Danitz have the time to wrap his scarf properly and wear his cap. "Where are we heading now?" Danitz asked with a slight pant. Klein glanced at him. "Find Chinese letter L-N-D." The corners of Danitz's mouth twitched, yearning to throw a fireball over. "To buy tickets to the Delineus Island," Klein added as he passed through the alley. Delineus Island was the first island past the south of the Rorstad archipelago. "Right, there's a ship there that heads for Gallegos." Now, with everyone's attention focused on the liners from Bayam to Gallegos, no one would imagine that we'd take a detour to Delineus Island and travel from there. Danitz followed as he was enlightened. On Tuesday morning, Klein personally helped Danitz don a disguise, making him look like a mixed blood who wore gold-rimmed glasses. Although there was no way to use his faceless powers, It was still at least 10 times better than Danitz's own attempts at disguising himself. They successfully boarded the ship and prepared to head south to Delineus Island Harbor. The journey was expected to take 10 hours. Whoosh! The liner left the harbor and steered into the sea. Under the bright sunlight, thin clouds, and blue skies, this hybrid-powered ship silently sailed through the gentle waves amid the cold breeze all the way into the afternoon. At this moment, Klein was inside the cabin, pondering over some content in the Book of Secrets. Danitz was pacing about, thinking about how he could brag to his mates. Suddenly, their vision darkened as though a cloud had drifted over to blot out the sun. Klein subconsciously looked out and saw that a gigantic pitch-black sailboat had appeared at some moment in time. It was nearly 100 meters long and had its sail fully opened. By the side were rows of cannons. Before it approached, it steered in a different direction, but it still made the surroundings seem to have a black sun pass by. Danitz revealed a reverent and apprehensive expression that was mixed with a longing but abhorrent look. He hissed before whispering in a dreamy manner, "Dark Emperor." 575 Golden Dream. Upon seeing the gigantic black sailboat, Klein's first reaction was fear and wariness. He suspected that the demigod, king of the five seas Nast, was here for him. But he quickly refuted that guess. This was because, apart from using the Dark Emperor card in the spirit world, he had nearly never made the card of blasphemy appear in the real world ever since he came out to sea. There were only 2 or 3 times when they appeared due to a summoning before it quickly entered the spirit world. With the gray fog screening abilities and the card of blasphemy's anti-divination and anti-prophecy traits, it's impossible for Nast to lock onto me. Klein calmed down as he got up to walk towards the window. Together with Danitz, he looked at the Dark Emperor, which defied sailboat logic. The gigantic ship slowly approached in the massive shadows as the scene on the deck became increasingly clear. The sailors were either washing the deck or bragging on the shipboard. None of them had drawn their cutlasses or guns. There was no sign of them planning to plunder the ship. Near the cabin, there was a mottled stone chair that was 2 to 3 meters high. On it sat a colossal man that was comparable to a giant. Before he could take in Nast's appearance, Danitz couldn't help but lower his head as his body became numb and trembled, to the point of prostrating himself. Klein also sensed the inexplicable sense of might and awe. He didn't forcibly resist it to keep his head up and continue looking at Nast. This had a high chance of attracting his attention, bringing him unwanted trouble. As a person with many secrets, he had to bow his head when required. Klein retracted his gaze as he admired the rugs on the deck. After an unknown period of time, he saw the sunlight illuminate the area again as the shadow vanished. He looked up and could no longer see the gigantic pitch-black sailboat. The wind and seas were calm, and the skies were clear. Why would he suddenly be here? Wasn't it said that he was still at the Fog Sea recently? Danitz frowned as he muttered to himself in puzzlement. That Dark Emperor can cruise through the spirit world, so it's very normal for it to come all the way from the Fog Sea in a span of a few days. This is also probably one of the reasons why Nast is the greatest of the 4 kings, Klein thought to himself. He believed that Nast was lured by the Dark Emperor card, but it was likely that Nast could only determine a vague area. Klein retracted his gaze and sat back down as though nothing had happened. The straight-line distance between Bayam and Delineus wasn't great, but a sufficiently safe sea route was filled with twists and turns, so it took the liner until sunset before it reached the dock. After that, Klein changed his appearance and used a fake identity to buy 2 early tickets and set off before it got dark. They arrived at Garga's at dawn. Danitz didn't enter the city and instead brought Klein on a detour to a private harbor. They then took a simple fishing boat and set off to sea. After nearly 2 hours, Klein saw a sailboat which was dozens of meters long. It was clean and produced a golden luster from the sunlight reflected on it. Compared to similar sailboats, It appeared extremely special. Along the central axis was the main cannon, which was stacked with symbols and patterns. Faint but pure light swirled around it. That's the cannon of purification. It can only be used 10 times before 6 priests of light are needed to hold a ritual. They will pray to the corresponding deity to fill it up with spirituality, Danitz introduced smugly. A gigantic version of a charm. After a certain period of time, it will likely automatically lose its spirituality. Backing Vice Admiral Iceberg is the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun, or one that can nurture priests of light. Klein's remained stoic as he mumbled inwardly. Back when he first saw the golden dream in Danitz's dream, he wasn't too surprised by the main canon. After all, dreams didn't need to adhere to logic. Perhaps Danitz had seen an ironclad warship, and its main cannon had left a deep impression on him, causing him to reproduce it in his dream. To Klein's surprise, the Golden Dream really had something that required extremely copious amounts of knowledge and mysticism. It wasn't something an ordinary faction could produce. Soon, the Golden Dream dispatched a dinghy and quickly steered towards the fishing boat. Danitz spread his hands open before clenching them tightly. He then jumped down and landed in the dinghy without causing it to shake. He whistled and struck palms with the pirate who was steering. He found the former feeling of ruling over the ocean again. However, this excitement didn't last long as the dinghy behind him suddenly dipped a little. One more person had joined them. I forgot about that madman. Danitz wiped away his smile and sat down. Klein observed the pirates and pressed down his hat. He sat down calmly without a word. Before long, he landed on the deck of the Golden Dream and saw Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards standing in silence. This pirate admiral was nearly identical to how she looked when they met in the dream. There weren't any changes to her hair or looks. She now wore dark trousers with a pair of leather boots instead of wearing a dress. She also had a valiant bearing to her wisdom and beauty. She's more like a pirate this time than a teacher. Klein nodded gently and smiled politely. "Good morning, ma'am, Captain." "Good morning, Mr. Jamin," Edwina replied with a smile. She turned around and walked to a spot where fishing nets were being hung out to dry. She signaled the pirates to walk away and get busy with their own work. Fishing nets. As expected of a pirate crew that's more like treasure hunters. This is in preparation to improve their meals. Klein followed in silence. Danitz very naturally found a few of his companions he was most familiar with to have drinks and to brag to. Of course, he didn't let down his guard. From time to time, he would glance over, afraid that his captain would end up exchanging blows with Jam and Sparrow. He was ready to get his companions to join the brawl at any moment. This time, Klein didn't wait for Edwina to explain why she had invited him. After 2 seconds of silence, he asked, "What do you know of Tracy?" He planned on asking all his questions before listening to Edwina's motives. He wanted to prevent himself from being embarrassed to ask further after rejecting a request he couldn't agree to. "Tracy," Edwina's eyes quivered a little. "She's a demoness, a Sequence 5 demoness of affliction." Demoness. Klein nearly lost it. He felt that his fate seemed to be intertwined with demonesses. First, it was Witch Trissy, and then there was Demoness of Pleasure Madame Sharon, and then there was Demoness of Pleasure Trissy Cheek, and a high-ranking demoness he only heard the voice of. Now, there was another demoness of affliction, Tracy. Edwina didn't sense the upheavals he was going through and continued, "She's different from the typical demoness. She has her own ideals and pursuits. She's quite an oddity in the demoness sect. However, she would still work for the organization doing work such as human trafficking or something else. Different from the typical demoness. She doesn't give up on herself and chooses to give pleasure to women." Klein suddenly thought of red-haired Helene. However, he couldn't be certain because not every demoness was the result of a man changing into a woman. There were real women who wished to become an assassin. After asking for the details, Klein deliberated and asked, "We met Nast and his Dark Emperor on the way here. In the recent months, matters involving you, Senner, Tracy, and Nast have happened in this area of the sea. This is rather abnormal. 4 out of the 4 kings and 7 admirals had involved themselves in the Roersted Sea in a short span of time. This wasn't even including the recently recruited Tarot Club member, Admiral of Stars Catlia. In terms of probability, this was indeed quite abnormal. Of course, Klein had some theories, but he wished to see if Vice Admiral Iceberg was able to provide some fresh insight. Edwina listened without saying a word. She pulled the edge of a fishing net and held it in front of her. She took out a fountain pen, a brass dagger, metallic bottles, and other things from her pockets and the inner section of her belt, and placed them on the spread-out net. They latched on firmly without moving. It didn't seem like there would be any interaction between them. At this moment, Edwina bent over and picked up a rock used to press down the net, and she placed it in the middle of the open net. The net immediately depressed, causing the surroundings to contract. The fountain pen, dagger, and bottles tumbled towards the center and gathered beside the rock. It's probably something like this. Some unknown existence has appeared in the net of fate and is pulling us towards it, Edwina explained simply. This is like an actual model of the law of convergence for Beyonder characteristics, Klein thought as he nodded. With regards to this, he was both enlightened but puzzled as well. He was enlightened because Edwina's explanation was nearly the same as his guess, but he was puzzled because it couldn't be used to analyze the problems. The King of the 5 Seas Nast appeared because of me. Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy can also be barely explained, since I did come into contact with Trissy Cheek. As for Vice Admiral Iceberg and Admiral of Blood, I can't find a reason. Perhaps it's purely a coincidence. Besides, it's the latter that attracted the former out. Klein retracted his gaze and asked about something else. Then he said, "Ma'am Captain, is there a reason for inviting me here?" Edwina gave him a deep look and said, "Your identity indicates that you came from Backlund. According to what I know, this identity isn't authentic enough. There's no powerful bounty hunter named J.M. and Sparrow from there. The faction backing you is very powerful. Furthermore, it has quite an extensive network in Backlund. You managed to so quickly notice a problem with my identity." Klein didn't panic as he smiled calmly. "Everyone will have some secrets." Edwina remained silent for a few seconds without pressing the issue. She then said, "Not long before Calvatua died, you sacrificed something to it." Klein turned his head slightly and swept his gaze across Danitz, who was drinking beer. Cough, cough. Alarmed, Danitz spewed the beer all over himself. Klein retracted his gaze and didn't deny or admit it as he looked at Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina. Edwina continued without a change in expression. After Calvatua died, the sea god is still replying to its believers. Thank you for listening to the story on KevinAudio.com. 576 Vice Admiral Iceberg. S. Collector. S. Room. Is she suspecting something? Klein looked straight into Edwina's eyes without moving them away, nor did his eyes blink or dodge. After knowing that Danitz had divulged his sacrificial ritual to Calvatua before it died, Klein had the necessary preparations. If he wasn't standing on the shipboard and was instead sitting on a sofa, then he definitely would have crossed his right leg and leaned back to give a calm and composed answer. He smiled as he raised his left hand. He introduced with a calm tone, "This glove of mine is called Creeping Hunger." Klein believed that Danitz, who had witnessed him in combat, had definitely passed the relevant details on to his captain. Therefore, with Vice Admiral Iceberg, Edwina being of equal rank as Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos, it wasn't difficult for her to guess that he had acquired Creeping Hunger. In that case, taking the initiative to divulge it gave him a psychological advantage rather than being exposed by her. and for him to suddenly mention it gave it a double meaning. First, he was hinting to her that he had an organization backing him, one that could kill Vice Admiral Hurricane and orchestrate Calvatua's death, and reply to its believers in its stead. Second, it was a warning for Edwina that she was not to attempt to investigate or delve deeper into the matter. Otherwise, the instantaneous death of Vice Admiral Hurricane awaited her. At this moment in time, Klein continued maintaining J.M. and Sparrow's persona. He didn't directly threaten her or refuse to admit it. Instead, he provided a calm answer that hid madness within it. Edwina Edwards nodded slightly and suddenly changed topics. I plan on providing a certain amount of assistance to the resistance in the Rorsted Archipelago, mainly in food and fabric. Assistance. Her backing faction is against loan, or it just wants to make things difficult for the Church of Storms. Klein wiped his smile and calmly replied, "This has nothing to do with me. Don't expect me to trip up," he said silently to himself. Edwina turned her head and raised her arm to point to Blazing Danitz, who was drinking while secretly stealing glances. "I will entrust him to handle it, including contacting the resistance and confirming the time. We'll arrange for a private harbor, and I wish you can provide sufficient help." Danitz spewed out a golden waterfall from his mouth. "Ha, PFFT. Bam, bam, bam." The two pirates sitting beside him laughed as they bent their backs and struck the deck, spewing out the beer that they had just drunk. One of them had dark skin like he was covered in a layer of metal skin. His waist was rather thick, and although he wasn't fat, he had no curvature to speak of. Edwina retracted her gaze and added in an unhurried manner before Klein could speak, "You're an adventurer. I believe you won't decline a job that pays well. You really have found me an excellent excuse." Klein smiled in response. Of course. He didn't ask how much the payment was, while Edwina seemed to forget mentioning it. This intelligent and beautiful pirate admiral gloomily said, "Senner got someone to pass me the news that he's willing to buy the key of the giants, which I previously discovered, for £5,000. It was the item proclaimed to be Death's Key. It was a gigantic black iron key that nearly made Danitz lose his life in Bayam." Klein suspected that it didn't originate from the Dark Second Epoch, but it was something that was connected to the Giant King's court. "She's hinting at me to offer a price." Klein was first taken aback before he came to a realization. He couldn't help but inwardly mumble, £5,000. I don't even know if the key is of any use, or if it really involves the Giant King's court. If it doesn't have anything to do with it, can I return it for a refund? Besides, there's no prior information about it. Even if I take it above the gray fog to divine it, I wouldn't receive any effective revelations. Yes, a simple inference is that if it doesn't involve the Giant King's court but some other treasure that I have no idea about, then it would be useless if I buy it. The only benefit is that it will disrupt Admiral of Blood's plans. It harms him without benefiting me. If it involves the Giant King's court, Admiral of Blood is unlikely to find the target location even if he bought it, as it's located in the Forsaken Land of God. Besides, I plan to hunt him. When the time comes, I can obtain the key without spending any money. It's equivalent to having him buy it for me and watch over it for some time. Although such thoughts are very idealistic, it's not impossible. Klein pondered for a few seconds and said, "It might be hiding a huge secret." He deliberately mentioned this to make Vice Admiral Iceberg unwilling to sell the gigantic black iron key to Admiral of Blood Center. It was to prevent the latter from rapidly strengthening himself after obtaining the treasure and step into the demigod realm. That would bring a considerable calamity upon Klein. Edwina listened silently and didn't continue on the topic. She turned her body halfway around and pointed at the cabin's entrance. "Breakfast has been prepared for you. Thank you." Klein took off his hat and bowed. As he followed Vice Admiral Iceberg into the cabin, He quickly recalled the conversation they just had and sought out the true motive behind Edwina's invitation. From Jam and Sparrow's identity problems, to the mystical item suspected to be creeping hunger, to the matter of the sacrifice to Calvatua while the Dead Sea God continued responding to believers, all of these matters put together does allow one to imagine that I have a secret organization backing me, one whose motives are unknown. As for the faction that Vice Admiral Iceberg belongs to, it's very wary, guarded, and interested in this matter. Therefore, it got her to probe me in person to see if they can obtain something. They're still rather friendly at the moment. Extending their assistance to the resistance is a way to convey their intentions. It seems they're leaning towards cooperating with the organization backing me. Of course, the unknown always leaves others afraid. Without grasping the situation, the chances of Vice Admiral Iceberg and company attacking me is very, very low. Heh heh. If they realize that the secret organization backing me was established only about half a year ago, including the World and Miss Zio, whose connection has been established but not recruited, there aren't more than 10 people. I wonder if they will get so infuriated that they end up losing control. As his thoughts raced, Klein entered the cabin and followed a dim passageway, passing through one wooden door after another. He followed Edwina up some stairs and arrived at a brighter second level. Before entering the pirates' dining hall, they passed by a half-opened room. Klein casually glanced inside and saw a gigantic black iron key sitting on a wooden table. These items are evidence from our various treasure-hunting expeditions. Most of them are mementos, while others have yet to show their value and require further study. Edwina appeared cold, but her explanations were in great detail. It had the feeling like she was afraid that he wouldn't understand her or was left puzzled. And when she mentioned the word study, her aqueous blue eyes clearly lit up a little. Evidence of the various treasure-hunting expeditions. Klein couldn't help but look inside carefully. At this point, Edwina pushed open the door and walked in. She then introduced in passing, "This is a gold coin from the Fourth Epic Solomon Empire." Klein's gaze shifted over and saw a coin placed inside a frame. It was entirely dark gold in color, as though it was combined from two semicircles of different dimensions. It looked extremely asymmetrical, and there was a sharp crown engraved on its surface. It looked very similar to the crown worn on the King of the Five Seas, Nast. Edwina was like an owner who liked to flaunt her collection. She began introducing the items in the room, making Klein recall a familiar person, old Mr. Eye of Wisdom, the great detective, Isengard Stanton. In regards to the trait of flaunting collections, they're very similar. Is this a tendency of people with huge collections? Wait, Mr. Stanton had studied in Lemberg for 4 years. Vice Admiral Iceberg's description includes information that Edwina Edwards that hails from Lemberg. This, Lemberg's capital, is the headquarters of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Mr. Stanton also admitted that he converted his faith to the God of Knowledge and Wisdom while studying abroad. Could the faction backing Vice Admiral Iceberg be them? Klein listened in thought until Edwina stopped in front of the huge iron black key. Just like he had seen in the dream, the key was about the size of a 7-string zither. An ordinary human would have to wrap their arms around it to move it. It was dull and ancient-looking. The patterns on it are similar to the City of Silver's style. It clearly has giant traits. Klein nodded and was just about to retract his gaze when he heard Edwina say, "You can study it. You are letting me study it. You probably have no idea how many latent problems I've triggered in the past. Aren't you afraid that the golden dream will disappear once you let me study it?" Klein criticized himself in a self-deprecatory manner before reaching out his right hand to touch the black iron key that seemed to belong to a giant's. He found it ice cold to the touch and regardless of how much spirituality he injected into it, it was useless. Unfortunately, I cannot bring it above the gray fog to study it. Klein retracted his right hand and shook his head indiscernibly. He shifted his gaze onto a book in goatskin placed on the same table. On the brown cover were words written in ancient Fasak, Grossel's Travels. It originates from a sunken ship. It had been soaked at the bottom of the sea for 165 years without suffering any damage, Edwina introduced. It records a story about a giant named Grossel. He had decided to head to the nation of Frost to hunt the King of the North, a powerful frost dragon. Along the way, he encounters companions, a female elf, a devout ascetic, an aristocrat of the Solomon Empire, and a lone soldier. The story develops until they encounter the King of the North before it suddenly comes to a halt. It's not the end, but the later pages cannot be opened no matter what methods are used. You can give it a try. This isn't a notebook in a journal style, but rather a novel. This novel sure is odd. It puts together characters from different epochs and eras. It should be something that was recently produced. Klein flipped through the book and allowed the yellowish-brown pages to slide past one after another. The content was roughly what Edwina said, but the story appeared rather abrupt and fractured. It kept making Klein suspect if he had missed a paragraph. For example, the protagonists would become familiar with one another moments after encountering each other as strangers. Soon, he browsed to the last few pages and found that they were stuck together. There was no way he could pry them apart. Such effects probably can be dealt with above the gray fog. I wonder what sort of accidents might happen. Klein turned his head to look at Vice Admiral Iceberg. Edwina fell silent for a moment before saying, "If you wish to have it, I can sell it to you. I've studied it for years without gleaning anything from it. However, I have a condition." "What is it?" Klein returned with a question. Edwina pursed her lips and said, "If you figure out something, you have to tell me the result so that I won't have to be puzzled over it. As long as you agree to this condition, I can sell it to you for cheap." Klein's interest was suddenly piqued. "How much?" £8,000, Edwina said calmly. Klein deliberately pondered as he nodded indifferently. "I'll consider it. I'll consider how to pretend that this never happened," he thought silently to himself. 577 book from more than 3,000 years ago. 577 book from more than 3,000 Chinese letter, EARS, ago. Vice Admiral Iceberg, Edwina, didn't show any changes in her expression when she heard Jamin Sparrow say that he needed to consider it. She nodded calmly. "No hurry. She seems to feel that I'm unable to make the decision regarding a transaction of this scale, and that I need to seek advice from the secret organization backing me. Is this a problem of me not being able to make the decision? This is a problem of not having the money." Klein lampooned and dosed Grosselle Chinese letter S Travels. He asked in a deep voice, "Do you know who the author is? What happened to the people who last possessed this book?" Edwina walked in front of him and reached out her right hand. She rubbed the cover with her fingertip and said, "The owners from before cannot be identified, as the sinking of the ship has resulted in the relevant information being lost to history. Similarly, we are unable to confirm who the author is. Oh, the book doesn't include the author's name. I've used some mystical arts to study it and discovered that the goatskin was created at least 3,000 years ago, before the cataclysm. This is why I believe it's worth at least £8,000. Won a book from 3,000 years ago. There's a dragon, an elf, and a human ascetic, a Solomon Empire noble, and a lone soldier. These are all concepts from years later. A magical book that contains the power of prophecy. Or did someone specially use an ancient goatskin to create it? But it's meaningless to do so. It's purely a hoax." Klein deliberately curled the corners of his mouth without any intent of smiling. "The giant's name is Grossel. Could the author be Roselle?" No, Roselle's name originated from a root word in Jotun. When ancient Fasak evolved into Intis, there was a second change, making it have a different meaning. Edwina explained in detail the origins of Roselle's name. It left Klein stunned as he felt like he was back in school. He nodded gently and said in an unperturbed tone, "If it's an ancient piece of work, I'm very curious as to why a frost dragon would be named the King of the North. What sequence and pathway does it correspond to?" Edwina raised her gaze from Roselle's travels and looked at Klein. Before the appearance of the first blasphemy slate, there was no concept of sequences and pathways. Furthermore, many creatures didn't abide by such arrangements. In that epoch, chaos and mania was the basic attitude to everything. Some dragons might gather many Beyonder characteristics related to Frost, just like a demoness S Frost, a zombie S Frost, and a weather warlock's Frost as such. It would possess rather powerful strength and a relatively high level. Of course, such a gathering would definitely lead to death and a loss of control. This means that if it doesn't die, it would definitely lose control and become a monster. However, a dragon is a monster in and of itself. If there are many similar products of this sort from the dragons, giants, and elves, then it can be understood why the second epoch is known as the Dark Epoch. Klein pondered for a moment and inquired as though he was talking to himself. This results in the wastage of Beyonder characteristics. Edwina looked at him for a few seconds. Emperor Roselle once said this: "Whatever separates will definitely converge, and whatever converges will definitely separate." The emperor said that before. I understand the first part. That's another form of saying the law of convergence of Beyonder characteristics. But what does the second part mean? After the convergence happens to a certain extent, it would tend to separate and dissociate. When one doesn't belong to a particular pathway, the extremely chaotic convergent mix will cause a dissociation. The more chaotic it is, the more repulsion there is between the characteristics. Such words aren't likely to be said to anyone. It definitely isn't something that's spread out in the public. Last time, I guessed from the Vice Admiral's usage of the Roselle's dream spell and her last name that she's a descendant of one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, Edwards. It's extremely possible. After the emperor perished, their family escaped to Lemberg and gradually converted their faith to the god of knowledge and wisdom. What a good teacher. She answers any question. Klein didn't speak further as he continued admiring Vice Admiral Iceberg's collection. At the same time, he had some thoughts. He planned on asking Little Sun via the world during the tarot gathering if he knew of the book, Roselle's Travels. Of course, in order to prevent the hanged man from sensing something problematic with the world and hence figure out that something was amiss with the fool, he decided to communicate in private while blocking everyone else. After a brief excursion of the room, Edwina led Klein out and entered the captain's room in the dining hall. The relatively special food here is yogurt. You can add strawberry jam and other things. You can also directly add honey. One Edwina pointed to the row of food outside. There's some dried fish that isn't bad. They come from the deep sea species that have yet to be named. As she spoke, she gestured for Klein to take the food for himself to bring back to the room. She then got up and made herself an example. Klein took some yogurt of unknown origins and added a few spoonfuls of honey. Then he carried his tray and placed pork sausages, buttered bread, and other food on it. During this process, he saw a young man dressed in a white shirt and black vest, decked out with a flowery bow tie, looking more like an office worker than a pirate, approach Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina and have a hushed exchange with her. The man had pretty good looks with almost blonde hair other than his slightly black hair roots. His hair was neatly combed to the sides. His eyes were a very light lake green color and his nose was sharp. He had thin lips and that made him exude a trustworthy vibe. Don't be fooled by that guy's appearance. He's a wolf fish can. He stinks deep down. Danitz whispered in contempt, having entered the pirates' dining hall and arriving beside Klein at some point in time. Klein turned his head and glanced at him without saying a word. This was because he knew Danitz would offer to explain without him egging him on. Without waiting for Danitz to speak, a man with a swollen waist beside him said with a crude and sharp voice, "He's the third mate, Jodson. He used to be a Casanova and part-time pirate, saying that he would steal our captain's heart, but he ended up getting a beating. He ended up staying to be educated. Dog's tea. In short, he's a bad egg," Danitz emphasized. "He's a bad egg," another pirated with iron-black skin echoed. "Why do I have the nagging feeling that all of you are the same?" Klein thought and said, "Flowery Bowtie Jodson with a bounty of 5,200 pounds. Sequence 6. As expected of the standard jam and sparrow reaction, Danitz glanced to the side as a lingering sense of fear was hidden within his contempt. "He's not that strong, but he's very strange. In my brawls with him, know when in combat, fireballs suddenly can't be used, and he will be able to replicate my fire powers." A very familiar description. Klein subconsciously glanced towards Jodson. After some careful thought, he recalled the familiarity. This is very similar to the sealed artifact, Blood Vessel Thief, found behind Tinjin City's Channy's Gate. Klein had already forgotten the Blood Vessel Thief's sealed artifact number, but he still remembered clearly that it could temporarily steal a person's Beyonder powers for themselves. The corresponding pathway. Klein retracted his gaze and discovered that Danitz and his two companions were drinking while looking in that direction. Thinking back to how Danitz divulged his sacrifice to Calvatua, Klein took a cup of beer and carried his food tray towards the captain's dining room. He said indifferently, "All of you like her, right?" Behind Klein, there was the sound of alcohol being spewed out at the same time. He saw Danitz jump backward through the corner of his eye, looking at him in horror before turning his head in relief to size up his companions. They had unknowingly opened up a gap between themselves as the look in their eyes turned complicated. They looked like they had the fury of being fooled. Klein didn't stop. He returned to the captain's dining room and enjoyed breakfast after a while. Edwina carried a meal tray back. She drank a mouthful of milk and paused before saying, "Danitz showed me the summoning ritual of your messenger. It mentions that 1 gold coin is a necessary component. I'm somewhat perplexed. Does it refer to lone gold coins or those from Inti's, Fasak, or somewhere else? Their weights are all different, and the amount of gold they contain is different." Klein thought for a moment before saying, "Lone's gold coin. This is also the gold coin that's worth the most. It's not like I need to pay for it myself," Klein added inwardly. Edwina nodded. "Payment also needs to be done when receiving a reply. Different spirit world creatures have different hobbies," Klein said. He knew that Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina was a researcher of spirit world creatures, and he believed that she could understand what he meant. Furthermore, he wasn't lying. He just hid the fact that the messenger's owner could also pay for it. "Yes," Edwina very seriously answered him. "I once attempted to find a messenger, but I could only use trial and error for the incantation. Not only was it dangerous, but it was very difficult to satisfy the requirements. I eventually had to give up. This is one of the reasons. The other reason is that simulating the power of the undead isn't enough to sign the contract. Your incantation has given me quite the inspiration." Klein ate his breakfast in silence without explaining anything. This was because this was the knowledge he had learned from Mr. Azek. He wasn't at liberty to teach it to others without receiving permission from him. After a delicious and quiet breakfast, the Golden Dream approached a private harbor and dropped Klein and Danitz off. Danitz looked back at the glimmering golden ship and suddenly sighed. "I feel like my friendship has sunk into the ocean." Klein pressed down on his hat and calmly said, "Losers can always form alliances among themselves." Danitz was unsure whether he should be happy or sad. After changing their identities and creating fake identification, they successfully bought tickets back to Bayam and boarded the ship. Klein finally had a private space for himself. He entered the washroom and went above the gray fog and began scanning through the believers' prayers. This time, the first thing that appeared before him was the bald member of the resistance, Kalat. Honorable God, we have discovered the whereabouts of red-haired Helene. She's currently hiding in the Inti's embassy. This has been confirmed by a laundry maid and gardener. 578 Abduction in the Inti's embassy of the city of Generosity, Bayam. Helene sat in front of a dresser, looking at her beautiful yet somewhat frail reflection. She sat there in a daze for several minutes. Her escape from the Black Death had been filled with anticipation and torment. She was afraid that any tiny mishap would cause her to be discovered by pirates or adventurers, causing her to be caught by Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy once again, and making her lose all her freedom. She would then never be able to return to her hometown and return to the life she originally enjoyed. Only when she used the meager connections left by her family did she manage to hide inside her country's embassy and obtain a ticket to leave the sea, providing her a little relief. However, this still wasn't enough to make her feel at ease. She believed that everything would only be truly over when she stepped onto the northern continent with this in mind. Helene couldn't help but raise her right hand and touch her cheeks, which weren't considered fair but was sufficiently healthy. She realized that her exquisiteness had improved significantly since her time as a sea merchant. She felt like time had reversed, making her mistake herself as returning to her days as a young lady. In fact, after entering the Inti's embassy, she had an additional choice other than escaping the sea: cooperate with the Church of Storms, Loan's military, or the embassy. By using herself as bait, they could capture Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. But after considerable thought, she finally gave up on this plan. She even begged her family elder, who was an officer in the embassy, to keep the information of her hiding in there from others. Regardless, she ultimately didn't cause me any actual harm. Many a time she indulged and satisfied me, apart from every night. But that's only on the surface. Amid her recollections, Helene quickly blushed red. Those intoxicating nights, the fiery passion from having limbs intertwined with each other, and the unimaginable pleasure flashed past her mind, leaving her unable to compose herself. Helene slowly took a deep breath before exhaling. She shook her head and made her pining for freedom, her homeland, and her family occupy her heart again. She once again looked at her reflection and coiled up her drooping red hair. Then she thickened her eyebrows with makeup and darkened the contours, making her facial features sharper and pronounced. After this round of makeup, Helene looked more androgynous, with a masculine air to her. Finally, she took off her clothes and used a cloth to flatten her chest. She then wore a white shirt, a black vest, men's trousers, and a double-breasted frock coat. Finally, she took a silk hat and wore it on her head, hiding the coiled red hair inside. At this moment, her reflection appeared more like a handsome young man than a lady. Her emerald-like eyes specifically seemed to suit her getup, giving her an alluring level of profundity. Helene patiently waited until someone knocked on her door. She picked up her luggage and walked out the door. She followed the good friend of her senior family member all the way to the side door in the embassy's garden. A carriage was there waiting for her. It was to send her to the harbor, where she would board a liner and head for the Lone Kingdom's Pritz Harbor. There, she would make a detour to return to Intis. Helene had anti-tracking Bayonder powers. She carefully observed the surroundings, including the carriage driver. A thin and virile local, doesn't like wearing hats. His looks are identical to the one I met before. He looks a little nervous, but that's normal. After Helene did her final checks, she thanked her family senior's friend, carried her luggage, and boarded the carriage. As the wheels started to roll, she pursed her lips and looked out the window, watching one Inti's parasol tree after another being quickly left behind. This gave her an inexplicable feeling as though she was back in Trier. It was a huge city filled with sunshine, located in the region of the Rhine River and Esrenza River. It was a radiant and enchanting scene with all sorts of roses. It was a place with bustling arts and humanities, a sacred land for artists, musicians, and novelists. That was Iritis's capital. After Emperor Roselle rebuilt it, it was in the true sense of the word, a world-class metropolis. It was also Helene's hometown. She grew up there and often cried when she saw it in her dreams. After an unknown period of time, Helene suddenly felt something was amiss. The surrounding streets were turning more deserted and remote. As a sea merchant, although she spent most of her time in the Fog Sea and wasn't too familiar with Bayam and the Sanya Sea, being a Sequence 9 hunter made her sufficiently alert. "Is this route correct?" Helene moved from her seat and carefully asked the carriage driver. She was prepared to jump off the carriage and produce a fireball at any moment. The carriage driver didn't look back as he continued looking forward. He said with a sycophant smile, "Honorable lady, this route is closer and it's not that easy to get into jams. As you know, Bayam was built years ago. Back then there weren't that many people or carriages. Many streets are narrow. Around noon and in the evening it's very easy to encounter jams. Walking would be even faster than taking a carriage." "Is that so?" Helene thought about it and believed his explanation. This was because she had encountered such situations in several cities. Trier is still the best. When Emperor Roselle reformed the old city districts, he had the foresight to widen the roads. There's sufficient space even today. Helene had this thought flash through her mind when she heard the horse pulling the carriage neigh, seemingly in pain. "Wait a moment, it seems to have stepped on something." The carriage driver stopped the carriage to the side and jumped off. Helene originally didn't think much of it, but sweeping the area with the corner of her eye, she realized that they were in an uninhabited, quiet alley. Her heartstrings tightened as she didn't hesitate to attempt breaking through the carriage walls and escape. Regardless of whether it was an overreaction or not, she believed that it was necessary. At that moment, an intense horror surged out from the bottom of her heart. It felt like she had been locked onto by an extremely hungry monster. The pressure she felt at a spiritual level left her hesitant. She didn't dare to rashly take action. Following that, she heard a deep voice. "I won't harm you. I have some questions for you." Helene's mind raced as she quickly considered the options placed before her. Ultimately, she didn't rashly escape. She sat back in her spot under the tremendously terrifying pressure. She planned on assessing the situation first before adjusting her plans. The door to the carriage opened, and the thin and virile local carriage driver walked in. He sat opposite Helene, and he was none other than Faceless Klein. In order to act as the carriage driver, he had specifically practiced how to drive a horse and carriage. This was a technique he had failed to properly learn while he was on the Tingen City's Nighthawk squad. Due to the little amount of time he didn't master it sufficiently and could only use Creeping Hunger's aura to successfully make the horse obedient. At the same time, Danitz, who was hidden nearby, quickly ran over and took the carriage driver's seat and began driving the carriage. His round felt hat was pressed low, and he was dressed like a real carriage driver. Helene bent her back in a guarded manner, like a leopard who was ready to pounce at any time. She felt that the gaze of the man opposite her was sweeping through her forehead, her eyebrows, her eyes, nose, mouth, neck, chest, waist, and legs. It left her extremely uneasy. She had encountered such gazes and methods of sizing her up back in Intis in Trier, and during the days when she was out at sea. It was something that disgusting perverts filled with sexual desires possessed, but this time she strangely didn't feel insulted. She didn't have the feeling that the man would rip off her clothes or was fantasizing about something abnormal. Instead, he looks like he's studying food. He's like a icy cold snake that's slithering across my skin. Helene finally couldn't bear it as she asked, "What questions do you have?" After fully grasping her looks and features, Klein leaned forward and placed his arms on his thighs in a natural manner. He slightly clasped his palms and said, "Have you heard of a person named Jimmy Necker?" Helene took a few seconds to recall before firmly shaking her head. She slightly frowned and asked in a daze, "Have you gotten the wrong person? He's a tycoon, someone who likes to collect things. Have you heard of such a person from Tracy?" Klein asked again. "Tracy." Helene sighed secretly and replied seriously, "No, she never mentioned a tycoon who likes collecting." Klein looked at the red-haired lady's eyes and said with an unhurried tone, "Then does her room have any ancient documents regarding the southern continent's Balam Empire?" "No, she's not someone who enjoys reading documents. She hates reading. She even gets me to read novels to her." With that said, Helene revealed a bitter smile. "What novels does she read?" Klein asked without a change in tone. "Those classics by Roselle as well as any contemporary romance stories," Helene answered frankly. Klein nodded. "Does she have a collector's room?" "Yes, but apart from her and a few mysterious visitors, no one is allowed entry, including me," Helene said as she recalled. Klein fell silent for a few seconds as he maintained an unchanging posture. "Tell me your story." "Mine?" Helene pointed at herself in surprise. Klein nodded gently without repeating himself. Helene said after momentarily being dazed, "My story is very simple. My father is a member of the former Sauron royal family of Intis. He received quite a bit of wealth, but he lost himself to alcohol, mistresses, marijuana, and gambling, causing him to eventually go bankrupt in order to repay the debts. I chose to accept some conditions raised by the family and became a beyonder. I then went out to sea to become a sea merchant." 579 academic question as she spoke. Helene's eyes moved up slightly as though she was immersed in her memories. "Early on, I transported iron and coal from Midseashire to Fainapotter. Then I shipped back tobacco, coffee, cocoa, and other native specialties back to Intis. This is a sea route that borders the shore, so it was rather safe. The competition was intense as well. In order to quickly get out of my predicament and save up money, I worked hard to raise my sequence, hoping that I could trade in the colonies. Unfortunately, just as I familiarized myself with the sea route and made some money, I chanced upon Ailment Maiden Tracy, who wasn't Vice Admiral Ailment at the time, in one of her raids during my second trip to West Balam. She only had one ship back then, but she was very powerful. My partner and I resisted with our lives, but all of that was in vain. She doesn't have the habit of killing mindlessly. All she did was snatch the goods as well as myself, as expected of an oddity among demonesses." Klein listened in silence and used his clown powers to suppress his embarrassed emotions to expressionlessly ask, "How far did the relationship between the two of you go?" "We didn't," Helene instinctively denied. "She forced me. One didn't want to die. One could only choose to accept it. Besides, she's a woman. Lady, there's no need to get so worked up. If I had asked if the two of you had a relationship that went beyond friendship, would you have jumped out? It's only because I'm kind enough and had considered your shame which had prevented me from being so direct. Sigh. Under the facade of the crazy jam and sparrow is a gentlemanly me. That's the true me." Klein switched to asking without a change in expression, "What kind of food do you like? Are there any dishes you especially like? Do you prefer sweet or salty food or somewhere in between? What food do you dislike? What food are you allergic to? Do you have any dietary restrictions? If you do, what are they?" These questions made Helene feel like she was in a dream, as though everything was surreal. She never imagined that the man would ask her such questions. It was like a pursuer was asking his crush what hobbies she had. No pursuer would ask such questions. These are all indirectly obtained from numerous chats, or are obtained by other means. No woman would like to be questioned like that. T. This is like a survey which Emperor Roselle created. W. What does he want? He's asking these questions without any expression. I'm so afraid. Helene fell silent for a few seconds before answering them one after another under Klein's cold, unmoving gaze. Klein maintained his seating posture of leaning forward and continued asking, "How do you usually sit? Do you have any habitual motions?" The more Helene answered, the more panicked she became. She had the inexplicable feeling that answering these questions would make her disappear. By the time the perplexing and terrifying survey was done, she felt heavy deep down, constantly suspecting that a terrible outcome awaited her. Why don't I risk it and jump off the carriage while he isn't paying attention? Helene seriously considered the possibility. However, the man didn't seem to have any indication of attacking her, and this made her indecisive. She felt that there was hope to resolve the matter amicably. After grasping Helene's personality, habits, and preferences, Klein turned the topic towards Vice Admiral Aylment. "What do you know of Tracy?" Helene fell silent as her mouth quivered a few times. She couldn't bring herself to speak. After the carriage continued on for quite a while, it was only then that she finally smiled ruefully. "She possesses excellent combat abilities. She's good at infiltration and curses, with her being capable of turning invisible and becoming light. She grasps the means of swapping bodies with a mirror or magic staff. As well as black flames and frost, she can make enemies in a certain range suddenly fall sick, including colds, pneumonia, gastroenteritis, and other illnesses. The longer the fight lasts with her, the worse the ailments inflicted. Some Beyonders might even directly die from a heart attack. She can also create invisible threads to control her enemy. She knows human anatomy very well. She can easily give people pleasure through contact, that kind of pleasure. She has an active charming ability that would make many pirates give up putting up a resistance once they're near her. She's often friendly, but she's cruel to her enemies. She enjoys destroying the perfection that others would wish to protect, making them suffer immense pain and torment. Helene didn't go into detail on how Tracy destroyed the state of perfection of others. There were many cruel stories and hilarious matters. This ailment maiden had once made her enemies, a father and son duo, kill each other, as well as instigate an enemy's wife to betray him and let him come across the scene. As expected of a demoness, she's a sequence 5 demoness who's one sequence higher than demoness of pleasure. Klein gained a basic grasp of Tracy's combat style, and he calmly asked again, "Does she have any mystical items?" "Yes, a bangle that's inlaid with diamonds. As long as she wears it, it's very difficult for Tracy to be injured." Helene hesitated before revealing Vice Admiral Aylment's secret. Klein asked a few other detailed questions as he straightened his body a little. "Tracy is helping the demoness sect perform human trafficking." This was something he took great notice of when he heard Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina mention it. The demoness sect cooperated with Nc Zangwill, and it was related to the royal family. It involved an underground ruin whose location was unknown. Tracy helped them in the human trafficking. Balin, who was pointed out by the hanged man, was someone who orchestrated numerous disappearance cases of slaves and the disappearance of primitive tribes in the southern continent, with him appearing at the underground mines. He would be a member of the upper echelons. The biggest human trafficker, Capim, had Beyonders who were of the Arbiter pathway protecting him. And this is a pathway controlled by the Lone and Fainapotter royal families, as well as their military. All of these matters that Klein was aware of linked together to form a line, but he wasn't sure what it actually exposed. Vice Admiral Aylment, Tracy was a breakthrough point. "What demoness sect?" Helene asked in puzzlement. "You don't have to know," Klein calmly replied. If you don't know what a demoness is and end up suspecting that the extremely charming Vice Admiral Ailment who gives you pleasure is a dirty and savage man, then I'm afraid that you would have lost control on the spot. You don't have to thank me. I'm a good person, Klein lampooned inwardly. Helene suppressed her puzzlement and said while recalling, in recent years she's been busy shipping slaves. The other end of the trade is crazy Captain Connors Victor. Rumor has it that he and many human traffickers and slave merchants in Lone have a deep partnership. Crazy Captain Connors Victor. Klein remembered the nickname and name. He nodded and no longer spoke in a heavy voice. Instead, he said in a relatively gentle voice, "Did you involve yourself in such matters, such as being a part-time pirate?" This very polite and amiable tone left Danitz trembling for some baffling reason. He felt that Jayaman Sparrow being in such a state was much more terrifying than his cold and expressionless state. "No," Helene shook her head. "The blood of the Sauron family flows in me. I will not bring shame to my family. Besides, Tracy always said that she wouldn't let me be tainted by bloodshed and darkness. All of that would be faced by her. She must have read too many romance novels." Klein took out a gold coin and allowed it to weave between his fingers like it was dancing. He didn't keep it from Helene as he performed a divination in front of her to confirm that she wasn't lying. The result was that she was rather honest. This is also because I didn't ask in detail about her emotional entanglements with Tracy. Otherwise, she wouldn't be that honest. Klein secretly reflected and put away the gold coin. At that moment in time, the carriage had circled around the harbor, no longer heading for the ship that Helene was meant to board. Klein looked at the scenery outside the window and took out a small metal bottle. He handed it to Helene and said, "Use the liquid inside to wipe away your makeup." "Why?" Helene subconsciously asked. "This isn't something you should be asking." Klein leaned forward once again and said without expression. Despite feeling aggrieved and furious, Helene didn't wish to agitate the man and get on his bad side at such a critical moment. She could only remove the bottle cap and took a sniff at it to test if it was poisonous. "Can it be used directly?" she asked. Klein tersely acknowledged in the affirmative. Helene took out a white handkerchief and dabbed it with the bottle's liquid. Then she began wiping her face and quickly cleaned away her prior disguise. Her aesthetically pleasing masculinity vanished and her contours became softer as Helene's original looks were presented before Klein. After careful observation, Klein calmly said, "Take off your hat and let down your hair." Helene furrowed her brows and had a nagging feeling that what followed would be unacceptable instructions such as taking off her clothes. She took a deep breath, removed her hat, and released her coiled red hair. Immediately, she appeared extremely feminine. Klein straightened his body and leaned back on the carriage wall before calmly instructing, "You can put on your disguise again." Is he a madman? After all this, he wants me to revert to how I was before. Helene didn't dare to voice her displeasure, afraid that the man would raise unacceptable requests. She hurriedly opened her suitcase and took out a mirror to look at herself. The makeup has been removed so cleanly. She was stunned for a moment before she quickly put on makeup and coiled her hair. When the carriage came to a stop, she was already looking like a handsome young man. Klein nodded indiscernibly and looked out the window before retracting his gaze. "One last question." "What?" Helene asked nervously. Klein raised his line of sight a little as his facial muscles moved. "How big are your breasts?" Helene was first taken aback before her face flushed red. This wasn't a redness caused by embarrassment but an anger from wanting to punch the man in the chin. Klein didn't move his gaze as he calmly added, "It's an academic question." Noticing no sexual intent from his eyes, Helene inhaled and closed her eyes to answer the question. Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief and took out a boat ticket and a stack of papers. "New identification, tickets to Tiana Port. Once you're there, buy tickets to Pritz Harbor." Helene glanced at him vigilantly before receiving the tickets and documents. She carried her suitcase and carefully alighted the carriage to see the ship she was taking. Klein followed behind her and watched her leave. From the corner of his eye, he saw Danitz trying hard to hold back his laughter. 580 Wormtongue Klein slowly turned his head and shot a glance at Danitz. The pirate with a bounty of 5,500 pounds immediately shut his mouth and clamped up. It was as though nothing had happened. After confirming that Helene boarded the liner without issues, he turned around and walked to the side of the carriage. He pretended to casually ask, "Did you hear the conversation?" No, a little, just a little." Danitz shook his head as he gave a hollow chuckle. Klein nodded slightly and said, "You have to remember, otherwise it'll be easy for people to see through you." "See through me?" Danitz raised his hand and pointed at his nose and said blankly. Klein said without changing his expression, "She's from the Sauron family. She has anti-tracking Beyonder abilities. Together with her tics and behavior, it can be confirmed that she's a Sequence 7 from the Hunter Pathway pyromaniac. She's very similar to you, and you'll be able to do a good job acting as her." "Me? I won't do. I won't be able to disguise myself like her. I'll be identified with just a look." Danitz jumped in fright. Klein held back his laughter and said in a deep voice, "I'll lend you creeping hunger." No, I have no experience in such matters. I won't be able to fool Vice Admiral Ailment's subordinates." Abnormally nervous and horrified, Danitz declined the mission. To him, this was an extremely embarrassing and dodge-tea matter. Only a pervert or a madman would complete it without any qualms. Klein nodded in agreement and said without an expression, "Indeed, you are rather stupid." Danitz forced a smile. "Yes, I'm very stupid." Klein didn't say a word as he walked past Danitz and opened the door to the carriage. Danitz followed him with his eyes when he suddenly saw Jam and Sparrow's hair turn red. He blinked his dull eyes and saw the man's facial contours turn soft and his eyes turning emerald green. His lips turned thin as they pursed, making him look frail and insecure. He had a masculine beauty and looked identical to Helene, who had just left. After watching Jam and Sparrow enter the carriage, Danitz turned his head back as the corners of his mouth twitched. He was silent for a few seconds before he muttered silently, "What a madman." He changed into a woman without any hesitation. "I have to say that Helene looks pretty good when disguised as a man. This Beyonder power sure is useful. If I can receive an item like that and figure out what Captain's ideal type is, then I can make the corresponding changes and make her fall in love with me." But in that case, would the person that she falls in love with still be me? Danitz found himself pondering over philosophical questions until he heard a cough from the carriage behind him. He snapped to his senses and drove the carriage away from the harbor. He planned on making a huge detour before circling back. Inside the carriage, Klein wasn't as calm as he appeared. Although Helene was in male clothes, allowing him to temporarily not bother about the most embarrassing parts, he still felt quite embarrassed to have his face change into a woman's while squeezing out breasts. This left him feeling down and awkward. A faceless's change in appearance is very easy. The difficult part is apparently the mind. To act as a good faceless, I'll have to cross many mental blocks. If I don't, then I'll have to spend a great deal of time to act as a real person for many years. My identity has to be recognized by everyone as I fully immerse myself into that character until I almost treat it like it's real. This is more challenging on my bottom line. It's crazy and warped. To speed up my progress, I have to overcome a certain number of obstacles. Klein pulled out a suitcase from under the carriage's seat. He rummaged for some cloth and clothes before replicating Helene's disguise. He could have gotten Danitz to act as Helene and borrow the mystical item with the faceless Beyonder characteristic from Justice for a few days without a problem. However, that meant that there was a high chance of Danitz facing Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy directly. Without the clown's powers, it was almost impossible for him to hide it from her, putting his life in extreme danger. It was impossible for Klein to make others bear such huge risks for his own matters. Therefore, he could only challenge himself and do it himself. Soon, he looked identical to Helene. Under the black top hat was a handsome, androgynous face with soft and pronounced contours. His emerald-green eyes looked as beautiful as gems. He adjusted his build, making himself shorter by a few centimeters and narrowing his shoulder width. His frame shrank and he looked like he had lightened significantly. His current appearance quickly surfaced in Klein's mind with his clown powers. It's still not bad. There's not much to it. Perhaps it's because I'm not in female clothes, so it doesn't feel much different from turning into J.M. and Sparrow, Danitz, or someone else. I just look prettier and have some discomfort in my chest. If I look like that on Earth, I wouldn't have needed to worry about not having a girlfriend. He mocked and consoled himself as he curled the corners of his mouth. What looked like a normal action on J.M. and Sparrow now looked pitiful and sorry. FK, Klein cursed silently as he quickly adjusted his state of mind. Bit by bit, he immersed himself into the state of true acting. With the passage of time, he discovered that the resistance he had lessened significantly. Following that, he felt relaxed and calm as though the potion had harmonized itself further. And that meant that the speed of his digestion would speed up. It really is useful. Klein said silently as he got up and took 4 steps counterclockwise. He went above the gray fog and once again confirmed the danger level of his upcoming operation. After returning to the real world, he switched to using Helene's voice and deliberately suppressed it. Head to Pier 6 at the harbor. Danitz didn't find anything amiss, but he suddenly came to a realization after changing directions. He couldn't help but tremble. It's like the real person. I wouldn't be able to distinguish him if the day comes where he transforms into captain to fool me. After a while, the carriage re-entered the harbor and went to the liner which Helene was originally meant to board. But it didn't truly approach it and had instead circled around to a nearby warehouse. Danitz jumped off the carriage and knocked on the warehouse's door, according to a prior agreed pattern. Out came a group of dock workers who were clearly of native blood. Following that, they made way. After confirming that there wasn't anything amiss, the bald member of the resistance, Calet, came out on a wheelchair. "Where is she?" he looked at Danitz as he asked. Through Helene's matter, Danitz had successfully established communications with the resistance. Danitz laughed mischievously. "In the carriage. She's been drugged with medicine that makes her lose her strength. Its effects will last another 10 hours. Remember, I want 70% of the 1,000-pound reward." Calet raised his right arm and waved it. Immediately 2 thin members of the resistance got onto the carriage. "Boss, it's that woman." They soon poked their heads out and said in the tone of a local gang. "Take her down. Our mission is to protect her," Calet emphasized again. Helene, who was disguised as a male, was helped down from the carriage with 2 soldiers supporting her on either side of her with his control. As a clown, Klein pretended to be weak in the knees as he staggered. He was soon moved to a room among the Bayam populace. At the same time, Calet instructed a local gang member, who believed in Sea God, to find strongman Ozil and tell him that they had found the target. He was to bring 1,000 pounds in exchange for the woman. As for Danitz, he had returned to the inn to await the news. At noon, Ozil replied saying that he couldn't be sure if the person was the real deal and had planned on sending a person over to confirm things. Calet agreed to his request. Closer to the evening, a figure appeared outside the house. He was a man wearing pantaloons and a jacket. He was low knees and was dressed in the style of a native. He had short brows, about half of the average person's. His brown eyes were recessed, and his face looked cut. Calet pushed himself on a wheelchair and appeared by the door. After seeing the man, he said in a heavy voice, "Mither King, should I be honored that you actually know me?" The man laughed. He was originally a captain of one of the pirate ships under Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. After Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy took over the crew, He took on the role as third mate of her flagship, the Black Death. His nickname was Wormtongue, with a bounty of 5,400 pounds. Callet didn't reply as he wheeled himself to make way. Mither entered a nearby room after being led by a gang member. Inside, he saw Helene sitting by the bedside in a gentleman's outfit. Her eyes were darting about and glaring at him. Her teeth bit down on her lip as she looked furious and fearful while having feelings of despair and obstinacy. It's her all right, however, I can't be certain because she's wearing thick makeup. It's hard to tell what a woman really looks like once they don thick makeup. Wipe her face clean for me. Hey, why didn't you cuff her? Don't you know she's dangerous? Mither surveyed the area and took